Hi, everybody. Welcome back to No Permission Necessary. Today, I am super excited to have a friend, my business partner, as our guest, Brad Sorte. He is a leading behavioral health CEO and family consultant. He's known for blending clinical expertise with strategic leadership. He helps individuals, couples, and families navigate addiction, mental health challenges, and complex relational dynamics. He's been a respected speaker featured in outlets like the New York Times and Forbes. He shares his insights on behavioral health globally and serves on the YPO board in Philadelphia and Palm Beach. His clinical approach integrates family systems theory, psychodynamic principles, and modern models such as the neuroaffective relation model. He is also the founder of Sober Companion AI and a whole host of other things that he does in his spare time. So I am pleased to welcome Brad to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, absolutely. My free time, so much of it. So,
Yeah.
Like we all
Truly.
have, yeah.
Exactly. And this is just a really special, episode for us. I think having men in leadership roles be able to speak to some of the challenges they've faced in their career, in their interpersonal relationships, just being able to grow in all aspects. So, Brad, you've spent years leading organizations in behavioral health. You're the co-founder with myself and your wife, Yasmin Sorte, for Yes Family Consulting. Can you share how your clinical background and your business background has shaped the kind of leader you became in your most recent CEO role?
yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for having me on. To really kind of frame that part of the conversation out, we got to go back a little bit further in time. So, when I was first kind of getting into kind of my more advanced part of my career in the behavioral health field, so around 2011, after I finished my master's in social work, I had enrolled directly into an MBA program basically the same week that I started at Karen. And really it was a function of having worked in centers prior to that, and then obviously my internships while I was in graduate school. I just kept seeing a common theme that there were really two broad categories of the way that healthcare organizations were led, or at least behavioral healthcare organizations. Ones that were run by a purely business-minded person, super focused on the P&L, admissions at any cost, keeping people at any cost, and in some cases even kind of creating a culture where they were monetizing relapse, which obviously we all know was
Mm.
certainly a major problem 10 and 15 years ago. But ultimately, that is an unsustainable business model. Quality of care goes down, hard decisions get made about services that are provided, and you kind of get into a vicious cycle. And then on the flip side, it was organizations that were run by, really strong clinicians, very well-meaning, but probably moved into a leadership role just through attrition, and really didn't have any business acumen. And while the problems that those organizations suffered from were different, the end result was the same. It wasn't sustainable. They weren't able to manage the business part of it. They weren't able to make the business decisions when they needed to happen. And it just seemed that there was a dearth of people who are both strong clinically and strong on the business side. And it seemed like that would be a good opportunity for the balance of my career to be one of the people who was able to do both. So kind of set out on that journey without a specific goal in mind, other than I would imagine that it would differentiate me as a candidate for any sort of leadership position if I was a clinician who had an MBA. And so that was really, kind of the thesis of it. And in a lot of ways, it was actually really valuable to be working as a line staff member in an organization while getting all of that tactical and theoretical knowledge, through my schooling, because it really kind of gave me a canvas upon which to start to conceptualize where I felt that I could add value to the organization, where I felt that I could add value to the field, and had, the better part of, 5 years to really be thinking about, where are the opportunities? Where is this field going? What are other people not looking at? And all of that really kind of dovetailed really nicely with my personality, which tends to be one that dives very deep into topics, tends to be a voracious consumer of information about them, likes to look a couple ridge lines into the future in terms of not just where we're going in the next year or two, but like where do we plan to arrive in the next 10 years and what are the problems that we really hope to solve? So, um, all that kind of came, full circle in a very timely way because I finished that program in December of 2014. I remember I was off in Costa Rica with my family and Yasmin at the time before we had gotten married. And, they're like, well, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I'm going to take a break. I'm tired. I'd
Yeah.
basically been in college or graduate school, but for maybe a 9-month period of time from 2000 to 2014. And so I'm kind of done with higher education for the moment and kind of making any changes. But of course, the, universe deals you hands, that you least expect. And, within weeks of getting back from that vacation, Sid Goodman was announcing announced internally that he was going to be retiring, that I was one of the internal candidates to take over for him. And so that kind of set off a journey that had, been the past 10 years of, really exciting, I would say pretty accelerated career growth. And, lots of very interesting problems and challenges that kind of came along the way. But as it relates to kind of my philosophy, in terms of leadership, I really believe that what's most important in kind of being a leader in any, type of setting, but particularly in a behavioral health setting, and I think this is really true for any role, is that you really have to want to be there. And that
Mm,
was one of the things that I saw, particularly with the clinical leaders who had kind of moved into those roles, was that very often it was by default or it was by I need to make more money. I've kind of maxed out as a therapist, but I could get a 20% bump by becoming a clinical director. But I would say that in a lot of those cases, those people were reluctant. It wasn't really what they wanted to do, or maybe it was what they thought they wanted to do. But once they were doing it, it just wasn't really what their strong suit was, or where their heart really was. And so, you know, I've always been very careful in terms of the things that I choose to do, in terms of the mentoring that I give people, to really scrutinize that question because you're going to need to be able to be passionate about something and want to show up and give it 100% every single day. And if you're not able to do that on the worst days of your career, then that is going to trickle down to the people that you're supposed to be able to lead. You're not going to be able to be an evangelical for what you're doing. You're not going to be able to help steward them through difficult times and difficult decisions, that may be very dark and may not seem like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And even if you're able to articulate those things externally, if that's incongruent with how you feel inside, we will all pick up
mhm.
on that.
Yeah.
So for me, it has always been making sure that any situation that I'm putting myself in where I'm in a position of great responsibility, it has to be something that I'm really passionate about, that I believe in, and that ultimately I want to be there, so that I can provide the best value for the team, the organization, and ultimately the future of whatever it is that we're doing.
I think Jill and I have talked so much about this, as far as individuals who move up the ranks in behavioral health just because that just becomes the next rung rather than the qualifications or the passion or the commitment or knowing how to lead or knowing how to manage. I mean, Jill can speak to this too because she's also a clinician who's
Mhm.
in on the business side as well, you know. So Jill, maybe a little bit of your experience there.
Yeah, I'm listening to you talk, and I know my business partner is always like, "Jill's a unicorn," because I'm a clinician, but also business minded. I don't have an MBA, but I certainly, run on the business side, and I think that a lot of clinicians, especially since COVID, right, don't always think about the business side of their decisions that they're making in terms of like, oh, I'm going to have to put a business owner hat on now, especially everyone kind of hanging their shingle post COVID and becoming, their own private practice essentially. I think there's so many issues with, and I think it's behavioral health. I think it's global though, in all businesses where people just kind of rise in the ranks. And what
Mhm.
happens is the people on the top don't necessarily know how to define leadership and what that position entails and requires. Right. And when we see this from a clinical director role, great. You need somebody who can, make good sound clinical decisions. Yes, but the person that's able to do that may not be able to get into those really dicey conversations with those staff that need encouragement, consistency, disciplinary conversations. Like I hear it more often than not from that middle management roles. I don't want to have those tough conversations with the
Mhm.
staff.
Mhm.
Okay, well, that's the majority of your role. So if you don't want to, I mean, I hate to tell you, but it's a parallel process. All these, client conversations and tough conversations we have
Yeah.
with the clients, once you move up into middle management, there's now that parallel process. We're having those
Process.
tough conversations
Yes.
with the staff.
Mhm.
And in many ways, the staff is like managing clients.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, I think
I
that's a
hate
lot
I
of
hate to say that, but it
I u
is.
I used to joke around and say that. There are people like, "Well, do you miss doing direct care?" I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure that I'm not doing as much of it as you think that I am, because there's an awful lot
Yeah.
of supervision that goes into this job. It's very intense, it's very emotional, and in a lot of ways, you have to play that role to help people see the forest through the trees, to help them, better allocate time for their own self-care, to have better boundaries. And that's, I mean, I think especially in these behavioral health organizations, like that is a classic example of entropy. It's just, it takes more and more energy and effort to kind of keep everybody on the same page, in a good frame of mind, morale moving in the right direction. And that at any point, if you take your foot off the gas, it starts to decompensate relatively quickly.
Mhm. What were some of the things that you really had to focus on, Brad, as you were starting to climb the ranks in your leadership role that were out of the box? Like, where did you challenge your staff? Where did you challenge the culture?
Hmm.
What was it that you really needed to lean into that really gave people an uneasy feeling and maybe, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that there was a couple of things. I mean, obviously, my two big leadership steps up in within an organization before being an entrepreneur were following executives who really, if were founder CEOs for all intents and purposes. I mean, Sid was
Mhm.
obviously a founder CEO. Doug was
Mhm.
not a founder, but he'd been there for 25 years. The organization was 10 times bigger. There was a handful of people that had been there longer than he had. So for all intents and purposes, if you're thinking of it from an organizational psychology perspective, he fits that mold.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
there's opportunities and challenges that kind of come along with that. And so a lot of the opportunities were really kind of looking at the things that I did or the ways that I thought that were very different from the ways that they did that maybe made it easy to solve some of the lower hanging fruit. There's always going to be some easier problems to solve when you're a new leader coming in, trying to prove yourself. One of the great lessons that I learned, and I actually learned this when I was interviewing for Sid's job when I did my interview with Doug, because he had asked me, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Well, I do actually. You became an executive vice president at Hazelden around the same age as me, and you became CEO Karen around the age of 40. So you were also a very young leader, likely working with and leading people who were, considerably older and more experienced, and many of whom probably were in some superior capacity to you before." And he gave me probably one of the best pieces of advice is, look, when I first did this, my attitude was, I'm going to prove it. I'm going to be hard
Mhm.
driving, you kind of bring my type A personality to it. And one of the board members said to me, said, don't do that. If you want people to follow you, help them be successful. And if you can help them
Mm.
be successful, your age, your experience, the fact that maybe you got the promotion that they wanted largely will not be a problem. And so that was really the attitude that I took, particularly in 2015 and 16 down in Florida, because there was a very particular culture at Renaissance. There had been fear for the better part of a decade about what was going to happen when Sid Goodman retired. Sid, protected the way that Renaissance did things, a lot of unique operational things that we did, a lot of unique clinical things that we did, a lot of things that broadly in the field were admired but not well understood. And it wasn't without the fact that there were things that we needed to change and evolve. And I'll get to that in
Sure.
a minute.
Anytime like somebody who's there for a long time, I worked at agencies where there's like rumblings of that, like this
Yeah,
person's going to retire soon. Like that becomes an underground conversation that staff is starting to have long before that actually happens. It's like this anticipatory anxiety of like what happens when we change, when the guard changes, and how is that going to affect me? It's all, it's fear based self-centered fear, right? Around like how is this going to affect me?
Mhm.
Because it that happens in organizations where sometimes there are negative outcomes when there's a change, and everyone needs to get on board with a new leadership style, which can be really uncomfortable for everybody.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say that the inefficiency that comes from those kind of hallway conversations and water cooler conversations and the angst that that creates, is pretty significant. I mean, probably
Mhm.
somewhat hard to quantify, but if that is something that's kind of bubbling around, if you're an organization that, there's knowledge that potentially it is going to be looking at having a sale at some point, or if there's going to be major leadership transition at some point. I would say that it's easy to say that it's a 5% headwind on people's bandwidth and their emotional energy because of exactly what you said, Jill, is that there's this fear about, well, what does this mean for me? I have a
Mhm.
good relationship with this boss, but, am I going to be able to have the same relationship with the new boss? Is the compensation structure going to change? Is our clinical philosophy going to change? And all of those things. When I ended up being selected for that role and it was announced, on one hand, I was the beneficiary of a sense of somewhat sigh of relief throughout the organization because some of the potential theories that people had, were someone from the outside or someone internally that didn't understand what we did. And so just by virtue of the uncertainty being gone, and that it was one of their own, I think that that gave me a strong footing to land on, where I still had to prove that I was going to be able to lead them and kind of be a steward and a keeper of the things that we did really well. But I wasn't kind of coming into an adversarial situation because, an outsider coming in and trying to fit into what we do, which again didn't often work. When we brought in outside leaders at like
Mhm.
mid level, it was
Mhm.
rare that that person worked out over the long run. So we didn't have a great track record of that. And that kind of gave me a little bit of a beachhead to be able to actually say, look, trust me, we're going to have to change some things, but we're going to keep the most important things, the most important things. And then really kind of having to find this balance between holding that role for the team in Florida, but then also needing to develop relationships with this new executive team that I didn't know from Adam that was up in Pennsylvania that, had their own thoughts and own agendas and their own priorities that had been held back for the better part of a decade. And so balancing the needs of having to
Mhm.
find the right things that made sense for us to start doing while also pushing back on the things that didn't make sense and maintaining a trajectory to actually develop a good working relationship with those new colleagues. So, Molly, your question about some of the things that were unique, there are opportunities that I kind of saw, in abundance, but people just, didn't seem to be able to wrap their heads around. One of them was, kind of looking at how we had greatly increased the sophistication of the services we were providing. We added new medical staff, we added new programs. Yet we had not really come up with a plan to make sure that we were correctly charging for what we were actually providing. We had not looked at our pricing structure in 5 years. And, one of the things that kind of came up was we were looking at the Ocean Drive program down there, which had been about, I would say 15, 20% below goal in terms of census. 14 beds, it was kind of around 8 clients on average per year, something like that. And at the time it was priced at 62.5 per month. And I remember saying, well, I'm looking at our competition or what the consumer would look at as our competition, and they're priced at 75 to 90 and they're not as good as we are. And I said, I think that we are losing people to those places because we're less expensive. And I think that we
Yes.
need to look at our overall pricing and we need to kind of raise our pricing to be commensurate with what we do. So at Ocean Drive, we looked at a price increase of about 20%. And at Renaissance, but with Renaissance, I said, let's get rid of all the nickel and diming. Like right now, it's like you get the base program, but if you want to do the residential family program, that's going to be extra. And if you want to do this thing, it's going to be extra. Just make it a flat fee. Say some people are going to get more of something, some people are going to get more of something else, and make it transparent for the consumer. And let's remove the barrier that we were having with families, which was, I want to come to do the residential family program. I don't want to pay any more money. And so now we no longer had to kind of negotiate that. And what we found going into that next year was that the censuses in both programs went up 20% in addition to the
Wow.
price increases. So, it was something that I learned in business school that most organizations don't spend enough time looking at is your pricing strategy. How are you determining that? Are you asking for appropriate amount of money for the services that you're providing? And the whole concept of being a Veblen good, which is what I thought Ocean Drive and Renaissance would be. And so, the whole concept that, there's more demand and more desirability as a premium good goes up in price because the perceived scarcity, the perceived prestige, and all of those things. And so, that was a relatively early kind of flag that I planted in the ground, with taking a very calculated risk of we need to do something. This should work. And if it does, it's going to change the game in many different ways.
Uh,
And I would say that that became kind of a hallmark of my personal strategy in leadership. It was being thoughtful about taking on the tasks, responsibilities, and problems that other people didn't want because they hadn't been able to be figured out, or, there had been people who had failed at them before. And, my philosophy on that is that those are great opportunities. Now, you want to be smart. Don't pick something that's going to be, a complete dead end. But like before I became CEO, we had issues with our regional strategy. We had issues with our business development, marketing, and admissions. It had had like 4 or 5 different executives over the same number of years. And, and I was asked, would you be willing to take this on? And I said, yes. And I remember I had a conversation with a colleague who's like, why did you take that on? You're on this great trajectory with all this success. And now you're taking on these problem child departments that nobody's been able to figure out. And I said, well, at the end of the day, they have to get figured out. Whoever figures them out is going to be, a hero. And if I'm not able to figure them out, at least people will be like, okay, well, you gave the old Harvard try, so to speak. It's not necessarily going to be devastating to my career. And so, that ended up being quite successful. I had some thoughts and ideas as to things that we weren't doing to be able to make it more sophisticated, track our data better drive our decision making. And ultimately, when those opportunities came up, whereas a lot of people I would say would shy away from them, whether it's hard conversations or figuring out where we're going in the future, or parts of the organization that needed to be fixed, I was usually the first to raise my hand. And, I have found that to have been a strategy that has really paid dividends a lot over the past decade.
uh,
I want to go back to like the concept of values, and you talked about some tension with, entering into a new position, pushing back against those things. I'm also thinking as you're talking, when you went into kind of like the cost of treatment and the business side of it, what I find is there is a lot of tension and discomfort, especially from clinical staff,
Yeah.
especially from clinicians. And I deal with this with even admissions and collecting copays, all that stuff, our own relationship with money and being able to have those conversations, because there's like this dichotomy of like we're offering to help people, but then we have to get into this conversation about money
Yeah.
that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. And I feel like from the business standpoint, at the end of the day, it's still a business, and we need to be able to, again, price the services appropriately, have the conversations and looking at competition. There's obviously this whole competition with managed care, but I'm wondering if you can just like maybe comment a little bit about that, because
Yeah.
as I was listening to you talk, I was like, "Ooh, I know that there's like a bunch of people that are probably listening to this that like it just doesn't feel good," because my background is in nonprofit work, right? I came from a nonprofit agency. Um and I still know a lot of people that work with the indigent population. They're working with people who don't have funds for services. They're hustling to advocate for people to get into these
mhm,
services. And their minds are blown a lot of time when they step into the private sphere and what people are paying for treatment and what that looks like from an insurance side and the services that are available. But that's a way larger issue. What I'm kind of questioning is like how did those conversations land, right? With like because you have to kind of get your clinical staff on board with some of that too. Like
mhm.
that's a transparent conversation of like this is how much our services cost. That goes down to like, well, I should be paid more then, and all those conversations.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Like money's a big thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, one of the critical pieces of that is that, culturally in your interview process, in your onboarding process, in your evaluation of somebody's fit, you have to really scrutinize and make sure that they see the value in what we are providing And
Mhm.
so they don't see it as how much does this cost? They need to see it as how much value do we give? And that was always kind of a coaching thing that I would say to line staff, especially again, looking at, programs that were predominantly populated by upper middle class and all the way up through ultra high net worth, would be to help educate them that the sticker price isn't as important as your ability to convey the value for that. Because
Mhm.
a $2,000 a month treatment that doesn't provide all that much and isn't going to do a whole lot is not going to be the choice that someone makes when choosing between that and a $30,000 a month program where it's overwhelming all of the different things that the person's going to get that are very specific and important for them and their client. And I said, so you got to understand some of the consumer behavior around people who are more affluent, which is that, yes, the price does matter, but what matters a lot more to people is understanding the value. And if you understand that what we are providing here is something that isn't provided anywhere else, and in particular, for families with a young adult at Renaissance who need 2 weeks of living with them residentially while they're going through treatment, there wasn't anyone else that was doing that. And so, from my perspective, the value proposition was overwhelmingly compelling because we might be the only place in the country that can help your loved one and all of the people in that social context. So
Mm.
it's shifting the mind
Totally.
from one of an attitude of scarcity, which is how much does it cost, to an attitude of abundance, which is what is my investment going to get me? And you would know very quickly from interviewing people, having them do their working day or whatever it may be, if that was going to be something that they could get comfortable with, or if it was something that was going to be a problem. And usually we would say, look, this might not be the right fit for you. You're a great clinician, you've got great intuition, but you might be more comfortable in an insurance-based program
Mhm.
because, that is going to be a much more familiar conversation around the cost of healthcare for the people that you're working with versus running up against the barrier, which is that people don't feel that they should have to pay for healthcare. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, the system as it relates to behavioral healthcare is broken. And your access to care, unlike going to the ER, is going to be greatly determined by your ability to pay still.
Well, we
Yeah,
just
I
talked about
remember.
that, Jill, yesterday. I mean, he said working day and I say share day, but Jill and I were just talking about that for her, for her agency to bring staff in for a couple hours, right? And for those of you that may not know about this, this is,
Hmm.
familiar in some of the behavioral health spaces, which is you interview someone and you really enjoy the interview. You think they interview well, they come looking professional, they're eager, they look good on paper, and then you really want to know, is this going to be a fit? And if you've interviewed enough people, fired and had people leave enough times, you typically realize that there's some sort of gap in the process. And so what filled this gap was what Brad just shared as a working day or a share day. Invite them into the center and really be able to see them interact with the staff for a few hours. It was an opportunity for them to get a sense of our culture, for them to understand who we are, and really start to have a parallel process where they're also interviewing us, right? So, first of all, it adds agency for the individual who's looking to, be hired. And then it also says to the rest of the staff that we're doing our due diligence and we're putting people in the right seat. And so I was just making that recommendation to Jill yesterday for a certain position she's looking for. And I said, have them come do a share day. It was the most
They're gonna have to.
effective tactic we did on the inpatient unit by far.
Yeah, I
You know
agree.
what though?
I
When
also
Brad
think that
when
for those roles, like doing some personality profiling can be really helpful,
Yeah.
whether it's a DISC
Yes.
or an Enneagram or whatever it might be, because you'll get, people can present. Look, we all know how people present an interview. You're getting a slice of somebody that most people can put their best foot forward, say the right things. They want the job, so they're going to
Yeah, the
say what
highlight reel.
you to do it,
Yeah.
and you get a better glimpse of it when they're there for a working day in particular, you can see if they're not a fit. I think that usually stands out very clearly, but I
Right.
think that for a lot of them, it's still kind of uncertain because people may still be in a performative way of kind of approaching it. But if you can see that there are going to be aspects of the way that the culture of that organization works that are just in conflict with the way that that person works, that's probably going to be a situation where you're going to have a high risk of turnover six
Mhm.
months or a year into it. And when you think about the costs that creates for an organization in terms of somebody leaving, needing to get somebody new up to speed, turnover for the clients. It really is a very significant burden on all aspects of the organization. So getting that right and maybe putting
Mhm.
a little bit more time and effort into it on the front end, but getting someone that can stick around for the long term ends up, really paying itself back significantly, just in terms of consistency and quality of care.
So you had mentioned wanting to speak a little bit today, I think on the front of misalignment. So,
Mhm.
seasons where your personal values and organizational direction maybe weren't in sync. So, what did that look like for you personally and professionally as you started to
Yeah.
transition through different seasons?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this really started probably a decade ago, probably around the same time that I ascended to take over for Sid. One of the things that had always really bothered me about the addiction treatment industry is that I would say that on the whole, I would give us a D in terms of our overall success. And why do I say that? Well, 90+% of people who have a diagnosable substance use disorder aren't accessing care. So that in and of itself to me is a massive missed opportunity. And it's not just because they're not ready. There's a variety of reasons that lead to it, and some of them are structural. I can't afford it. I can't leave my family. I'm not ready to do this yet. But some of it are things that are philosophical, like nobody seems to be wanting to meet me where I'm at. Everything feels a little bit too one size fits all. And I felt that that wasn't a topic of conversation that was brought up enough when we would be speaking at conferences, when we would be collaborating with professionals. Like this was something that has kept me up at night for 10 years because,
You're speaking my language.
yeah, we think about the number of people that have,
I
kind of
mean,
suffered and died as a result of that. It's staggering.
well, the amount professionals and programs that when I'm vetting them and I'm talking to them about, okay, well, do you offer medication assisted treatment? Oh, well, we'll do this, but we won't do that. Okay, but why? The evidence shows that this is saving lives. So why aren't we offering this in treatment? Because again, it goes back to that philosophical. We don't believe in that because whether we're whatever modality, we're 12 step, we don't believe it. Who says Bill Wilson didn't believe in that? Like, we have to go by what the evidence shows. If you're going to call yourself an evidence-based program, let's use the evidence-based, treatment modalities that work. And I've been railing against this again, probably because of my nonprofit and state background, right? Like I've worked with that population, the Medicaid population, where, we're offering things that they're seen as they're looked down upon, I think, in more higher end treatment. Like we don't want that. It's like, okay, well, do you wanna be right or do you wanna be happy, and do you wanna be
Yeah,
alive? Because at the end of the day, this addiction is killing people.
yeah, 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 and I couldn't agree more. And the medication assisted treatment is kind of one of the biggest, more recent examples of this phenomenon. But we can trace back history, and this goes back to women not being allowed in AA or drug addicts not being
Yep.
allowed in AA, and then it was
Mhm.
people who are on buprenorphine maintenance or methadone maintenance are not really sober. You're just substituting one thing for another, and
Or
what
your psych meds. If you're
Or
on
your psych
psych meds
meds.
that are prescribed by a doctor,
right.
you're not really
You're on an
sober. Okay,
antidepressant.
who's making up these rules? This is wild.
Which, I am, I think that 12-step fellowships provide an immense amount of value and benefit to a lot of people, but I do feel that administratively there are some challenges to it. That because there's kind of it's a decentralized kind of non-governed thing, there isn't really some sort of protocol or process to make sure that people aren't doing harm. And it always kind of made me a little bit uncomfortable because there's a significant power dynamic between a sponsor and a sponsee. In many ways, because they're probably spending more time together, the power dynamic is even more significant than between a clinician and the client. And if
Mm.
I'm someone, a 19-year-old coming out of treatment who's on, an antidepressant, or maybe more so these days, maybe I'm on a psychostimulant because I have severe ADHD and I need to learn how to stay abstinent from other substances while also being on this. Because if I'm not on it, I'm probably going to go get cocaine or meth or something else because I need some sort of dopamine regulator to help me function. Now I've got some armchair psychiatrist who didn't go to medical school, maybe didn't go to college, maybe didn't finish high school, telling me that I need to make a choice. Either follow the directions of my doctor
Or you're
or
not sober.
be ostracized from this community. And there's
Mhm.
really no process in terms of arbitrating that. And I always kind of found that a little bit perplexing. And I think that goes back to kind of, the broader issue here is, which would be what, I would kind of rail against, is that we allow too much dogmatic thinking to kind of govern what should be more academic and objective conversation. So, you know, all the examples that we just gave, despite the staggering evidence that buprenorphine maintenance saves lives and reduces relapse, we gate kept that from people. And I wonder how many people we killed as a result of it. Not
We
being
still
willing
do.
to discharge opioid use disorder clients with Narcan because it's giving them permission to relapse.
Crazy.
Insane, insane. And the reality is
Mhm.
there are still pockets of this industry that have issues with these things that we are talking about. So what are the consequences of this beyond
Yeah,
death?
what are the
We
consequences?
we we look we look incompetent to society. We look inconsistent. We look mealy mouthed and we look like we don't know what we're doing because we can't have consistent messaging on what works and what doesn't work, what is a good outcome and what's not a good outcome. And probably the thing that bothers me the most about it would be we will talk out of both sides of our mouths, being at, like, I remember a very specific example. It was at NATAP in San Diego some years ago. And, a group of people were talking up on stage. I think at this point with conferences, like if I was speaking at them, like I literally flew in for my thing and left because I just, became so disillusioned with what was happening at them. Talking about it's a chronic illness and we need to reduce stigma and we need to have compassion for the people who are struggling. Yet meanwhile, in the lobby outside of it, there's the rumor mill, there's gossiping, there's talking about this person who might have relapsed and how can he be working in the field and how can she be working in the field? And I'm just disgusted by
Mm.
it. We can't even practice what we're preaching. It makes us look so disingenuous and so dishonest. And again, a lot of it comes back to the fact that, there's a lot of people that still have their work to do. There's a lot of sophistication that needs to continue to grow into this industry. And until we get out of this subjective and dogmatic way of thinking broadly, I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that have done this, but we got to get on the same page, all 17,000 centers across the country, and actually be singing off the same sheet of music and addressing these issues without emotion and doing it with objectivity. We're going to continue to see these barriers to access that we've seen all along, because if anyone's looking for a reason to say, I don't trust this, we give them plenty.
Well, I would also say that from a, and we can talk about this next, your work with families, but when we talk about from a family perspective, I clearly remember getting into an argument with an at-home treatment provider that I was working with when I was an individual therapist in my own little office, and opioid use disorder client, severe, has had a history of overdoses in the past. I asked the team, you have a prescriber on staff. Can you please get Narcan in the house and educate, the family on how to use
Mhm.
it? Well,
Mhm.
the mom's a nurse, she knows how to do it. Okay, but have you prescribed Narcan? I can't do that. I'm a therapist. I can't prescribe this. They push back, they push back. Well, one day, client didn't show for an appointment. I get a call later on that they overdosed in the house. Thank God I don't know when or how, but they didn't have Narcan, but the emergency providers got there
Mhm.
soon enough to Narcan them.
Mhm.
But I'm like, after that, my confidence in now working with you, I shouldn't be the one calling the shots on this. You guys
Right.
have the access and ability to do this. But from a family point of view, when you say things like, well, um, having Narcan's permission to use. No, it's
Yeah.
just like if you had a heart attack survivor. It's like, making sure that people in the house know how to do CPR. I don't,
Yeah.
it's like the
Or
same,
have an
it's an,
AFib or the AFib
or the
machine
AFib
will have
machine.
right,
Exactly.
right,
Well, don't
right.
say that because I don't have that in my house. Maybe I should. But anyway, um,
Yeah.
I just, from a family perspective though, I talked to a family this week, they get a family called over the past week and said that a professional told them that in order for them to get sober, they have to go far away from their home.
Yeah.
I said, "Sir, I don't I'm not sure who told you that, but
Yep.
in my experience, that's not that there's no evidence. There's no research paper stating that. There's a lot of research that's done, but that's not one of the markers. Like you can get sober in your backyard. There's a variety of ways to get sober. I can
Mhm,
tell you the evidence-based ways I know about, but
mhm,
going far away sounds more like they want you to go to their treatment center far away is what it sounds like to me.
mhm,
Yeah, and
But
I
how do you work with families when they've
yeah.
been told these things that aren't necessarily true and kind of like debunking these myths that they're
mhm,
told?
One of the first conversations I always have is I tell them that you need to consume behavioral health the way that you would consume cancer treatment. You know, if your loved one, if your son or whoever the concerned person is was diagnosed with some sort of, complex cancer, you would not just take them to the local hospital and say, do what you need to do, kind of take it as a given and, not kind of scrutinize is this the right decision. You go to Dana-Farber, you go to Sloan Kettering, you go to Mayo, you go to MD Anderson, you go to Hopkins, which is easy because it's like, okay, well, those are easily five of the best cancer hospitals. It's actually a lot harder in behavioral health because I bet you between the three of us, we probably wouldn't be able to come up with what are the parallels for those five in behavioral
right,
health.
right,
But
right,
ultimately, you're going to make a decision based on what does the team say? What are they saying their approach is going to be? How individualized is this to the unique situations and the challenges that my loved one is experiencing? Because at the end of the day, anybody that's telling you absolutes about what works and what doesn't work, run, because there are no absolutes. And anything under the right circumstances that has a body of evidence might be the right thing for a person.
mhm,
And this kind of
mhm.
fiefdom zero sum debate that I have been in the room with for many of them, I think continues to be an issue where you have the abstinence people on this side, you have the non-12 step people on this side, you have the harm reduction people over here, you've got the moderation management people over here, and everybody, the brain disease people over here, the learning disease people over here, genetics people over here, and all of these pieces could potentially have a role in understanding what's going on with a person. But too much of that conversation historically is they're all wrong. This is what's right. And I'm like, well, you
Mhm.
actually have some pieces that actually sound right, but that doesn't mean that these pieces don't also have some relevance as well. And until we break down that conversation, I think that we're going to continue to, be trying to make the sum of the parts be equal to the whole, and it's just not going to work. And
I I
yeah,
remember so specifically where I was essentially my mind was changed around the recovery process. And it was really early on. I had, gone through my own recovery process. So naturally, I was concrete in my belief system, right? These are all the ways that I tried, and this was the way that I was able to get and stay sober. So there was a litany of evidence behind me.
yeah.
And what happened was I was in one of my courses as I was going to school for addiction counseling, and I really got into it with the professor and basically kind of stood on the hill. This was the only way. My experience, this has been the only way. And she was such a leader in the space at this institution that she really kind of brought back a pretty decent amount of evidence and challenge, right? And said, this is your experience, but this is the experience that I have with this person or this group of people or the classes that I've taught or the internships that we've led. And really what she helped me to kind of open my mind to was that I needed to lean into these other processes. If I felt as though this was the only way, there's really no need to further get an education because I'm only going to be one track minded and I can kind of stay one track minded and be able to help the group of people that's directly in front of me, right? In 12 step communities. But if I really wanted to expand my career, and this was, 15 years ago now, if I really wanted to expand my career, I needed to be able to start to look at all the different agencies and avenues that help people on the path of recovery. And I'll tell you, I tell people today, even if you have not gone to have exposure in other agencies with other individuals, with other internships, with other colleagues, if you haven't sat in the rooms across from people that have done it differently than you're doing it wrong, right? You're not really getting the experience. You're only living through your own lens. And I think that's probably one of the biggest issues in behavioral health, and especially with families too, right? They also get stuck in their own lens, and it's up to us. And Brad and I, do this quite frequently with families is they need exposure to different avenues, right? And at the end of the day, when we're talking about families and what it is going to take for them to make a change to help migrate the system in another direction, whether their loved one is struggling with addiction or a mental health crisis, really what we're talking about is what level of comfort
Mhm.
and discomfort they can tolerate. Because the discomfort to be able to make the change exists. We're not saying that we know best, but we're going to push you to probably look at things a little bit differently than historically what you've done. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, they have to feel comfortable with making that decision. I tell families very regularly, I can give you recommendations, I can give you suggestions, but you have to be able to sleep at night.
Hmm.
And it's a real thing for families. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
So,
I always say in the absence of curiosity, it leaves only judgment. And that
mm,
happens within family
Or
systems with
fear.
clients or
mhm,
fear. Yeah. But again, judgment is usually rooted in fear. So it's kind of, I'm afraid
sure.
of this. I don't understand this. I'm threatened by this. And so therefore I'm not curious about why. I mean, just look at society today and how we have lost curiosity and we just resort to judgment. Our entire
Yeah.
polarized
Yes.
political society is a function of no curiosity and a tremendous amount of judgment. The amount of judgment that people on
Yeah.
both sides of the aisle feel towards people that they've never met, they've never spoken to, they've never been in the same room as, yet they're certain on a deep fundamental level that they're correct and righteous and the other person is wrong. And so
I
we see
actually
this all
learned
the
I
time.
actually learned this month though, or in the past like couple weeks, that your amygdala is what fires off, right? Like which is in the back of your brain about fear, right? And
Yep.
so that's what kind of leads this uh gut reaction about like anxiety, fear, all this stuff. But if you have hold some curiosity towards things, you cannot hold fear and curiosity in your amygdala at the same time. It almost like
Mm,
switches it on and off. So that is the way for us to switch some of this, just by asking questions, being curious, admitting that you don't maybe know the answer.
Yeah.
Because,
And I'll tell you that probably that would be the other kind of leadership thing that's been critically important for me. I'm a super curious person. Whether it's like, I don't know something about this, I want to learn more about it, or even something as simple in like operations management, like when someone would come running to my office, like all hysterical, did you hear what so and so did? They did this, they did that, they did this. I'd be like, well, that doesn't sound like them. Is that what really happened? Were you there? And it's like, well, no, I heard it from so and so. I'm like, well, okay, well, why don't we actually go talk to the person and see what actually happened? Oh, okay. That's not
yeah.
exactly what happened. Oh, that person walked in halfway through and just saw the second half of it. And it's amazing how hard it is to try to get people to slow down and not assume that something that doesn't make sense is probably true just because it was presented to you, and not first go to, let me make sure if this is true because it doesn't really add up. I mean, I've always been a big believer in, don't don't assume malice until you have ruled all other explanations out. Because
Mm,
most people, 99.9% of people are not malicious. People make mistakes, people misunderstand things, but if we're jumping to ill intent from the get-go, then we're immediately judging whatever is going on. We might be able to rein it back in, but look at all the collateral damage that occurs as a result of it. And that's kind of, the curiosity thing I have felt has been an important responsibility for me in this field because of the way that my brain works and kind of the things that I'm interested in, because of my comfort level and kind of dealing with a cross disciplinary set of things, whether it's technology, the future, finance, clinical, family systems, whatever it may be, I have felt that it's important in a field that I think struggles with that to try to interpret and translate and stoke some of that curiosity. And I've been doing that for many years. Probably the most kind of interesting example of it was it was 7 years ago. So it was like September, October 2018. I did this speech at the Moments of Change conference at the Flagler Steakhouse for probably 200 people that I was like, I'm going to talk about disruptive technology that most of you don't know anything about yet, but I'm going to tell you how it's not something that's down the road. It's already here. And then I'm going to show you how it's already affecting our industry. And my hope with this is that you leave tonight with a little bit of knowledge, but more importantly, a sense of curiosity that I need to start learning about this stuff because before you know it, these things are going to be here. And I run the risk of either gatekeeping helpful things from my clients or being relegated to obsolescence because I couldn't get on board with it. And it was really fun. I mean, one of the big components of it was artificial intelligence, which, at that point in time, like one person in the room had really kind of begun to look at in one way, or another. The rest of the room had, it looked like science fiction. But even now, 7 years later, I have had people coming to me saying, "Hey, you were talking about this 7 years ago. I can see it now. What do I need to know? What do we need to do to be prepared for it?" So that was just I think it was a really exciting thing. And my whole thesis
Mhm.
behind it is if we can just challenge our availability bias and our tendency to favor the familiar over the unfamiliar, we will realize how many things are right in front of us that we can deploy, that we can access, that we can, shape in ways that can create better outcomes. And in our field, I find that that is extraordinarily important. We're not just making widgets where if we don't make as many widgets, then the business doesn't do as well. We're in a business where if
Mhm.
we're not doing the best possible thing we can and providing every resource to our clients, they might die. And so I'll be damned if my own internal fears and anxieties and discomfort with the unfamiliar is going to be a causal factor in the loss of somebody's life. And I just think that's a
Yeah.
responsibility we all have to hold.
I wish we all held that line in the field, right? It's not that easy though. How
No,
how
it's
do you
not.
feel like you've had to change course when maybe, I think we probably share a lot of similarities in that we kind of broke off on our own
Yeah.
because you get to a place I feel like where you're like, I can maybe not just do this better, but do this in a way that feels better when I lay my
Yeah.
head on my pillow at night.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that was, that became, readily apparent to me, the end of 2022, that, that there was a divergence in the sense of urgency and the level of investment that I felt that the organization needed to make versus what the organization felt they needed to make. And that's just not a winning solution for anybody. That the CEO and the organization cannot be misaligned. There has to be a shared vision for the future, and that kind of coincided with the emergence of kind of the first mainstream kind of broadly available and broadly used AI large language model, which was ChatGPT 3. So kind of seeing that divergence, feeling that maybe I had done all that I could do to make the mark in the way that I wanted to within somebody else's platform. And one of these technologies that I was talking about that was very passionate about that I felt could be an extraordinary lever in solving many of the issues in the behavioral health field was coming of age. It just became apparent that, it was time for me to go and do my own thing. And it was time for me to take all the experience, all the learnings, and the 2 decades of thinking about where we're going and have the courage to overcome the fear of saying, I'm going to give up a safe and secure, sure thing that maybe wasn't really, very well aligned. But again, like I'd have to get another paycheck. Like, I'd have to figure out how to bridge that gap. But it was so important to me because it felt like in our lives, we probably get one window when our passions, our skill set, and the changes in society or business or whatever it is all align. And
Mhm.
I think it's incumbent upon us when we see that to push through whatever fear is there and say, I'm not going to waste this decade not being able to follow my dream, the dream that I have been dreaming for many, many, many years, which is the democratization of treatment, which is greatly increasing the ability to have efficiency and quality and consistency in how we deliver care, and being able to ensure that, we can begin to move this illness in the direction that we've seen with things like HIV. which in 1993 was a death sentence. But
Mhm.
today is a chronic illness that can be managed, and you will die from something else being asymptomatic and non-detectable. That's our lodestar. We need to embrace the same attitude that every other chronic illness organization has, which is we haven't found a cure, a solution, whatever it might be yet. Type 1 diabetes, same thing. Haven't found a cure yet. But I don't believe that we should be living with a lowered standard of, well, this is different and that's not something that we're going to be able to solve for. I don't believe it. And I don't think that it is doing justice to the 100, 200,000 people every year that die from alcohol and drug overdoses in this country to resign ourselves to a mediocre outcome as opposed to doing the best that we can while striving for a world where nobody needs to die from this.
Do you feel like there's any misconceptions that people have about you, Brad, especially through the transition of leaving probably what looked to be the, gold standard position, right? Climb the ranks. You were an alumni of the program. You were able to really create a trajectory for yourself. Is there anything that you feel just hasn't been said that you hope people to hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most important thing, was, and I'll make this as pithy as possible because it could potentially be a much bigger topic, was, the 2019 to 2022 was a year, were 3 years of extraordinary change and transition in my life. We
Mhm,
were living in Florida. We were asked to move up to Pennsylvania if I was interested in, being considered for CEO. We came up here for 3 days, looked at like 20 houses and a piece of dirt and said, okay, we'll build a house on this piece of dirt in a place we'd never been before. So building a house, figuring out, kind of moving our family up there, schools and all that stuff. In July of 19, we had picked Memorial Day weekend 2020 as the weekend that we would move, which seemed like a good time to move. But then that landed right in the teeth of COVID and right in the middle of all these, all this social unrest. It could probably was like the worst weekend in my lifetime to be moving across the country. And then kind of being thrown into all the massive disruption that all businesses were experiencing during that time. Leading the
mhm,
COVID response team for Karen, managing the business with my colleagues through all of that, having to make some very, difficult changes and cost reductions. And then, kind of coming into the end of that year, taking over as CEO of an organization that was still being affected by COVID and on the precipice of, once in a business cycle, significant inflation that for any behavioral health organization, which is 55 to 50, 65% cost of human capital, is a very burdensome thing to overcome because you're not moving your revenue line at that same pace. So, kind of the accumulation of all of those things, kind of the divergence in terms of philosophy and direction, and the extraordinary feeling of responsibility that if we didn't make these changes, we were not going to be well suited for what's to come in 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. Really led to kind of a tremendous amount of burnout. And kind of it all
mhm,
culminated, right around Thanksgiving, 2022, where, I checked into the local hospital here in Paoli thinking I was having a heart attack. And, they're like, well, your heart's fine. Like, what's your stress level like? And I kind of chuckled. I'm like, I'm really good with words, but like I actually don't have the correct superlative to be able to describe just how extraordinarily
mhm,
stressful things are right now. And they said, well, you probably need to take a look at that. So I chose to, take Christmas and New Year's away from my family, go away to kind of really work on this. My anxiety was super high. My depression, which I had never really had before, was, really, was really prevalent and this was absolutely the best decision I ever could have made. It
mhm,
was, I went for 2 weeks. I decided to stay for a third, and was really able to kind of recollect myself and get out of this, very, very acute fight or flight response on a day-to-day basis. I was getting up at 4 o'clock every single morning, staying up till midnight every single night, 4 o'clock, I'd work. I'd go to work. I'd work in the evenings. And so it was unsustainable. And not to mention, I've got 2 young kids where I'm a ship passing them in the night, which really was not, me kind of honoring the obligations as a dad and as a husband. So this really gave me a
Mhm.
tremendous amount of clarity that coming back from that, I needed to really make a decision, and I needed to kind of make it very clear that this was a decision that, if we're not aligned in where we're going, if I'm not able to, execute and pursue these things that I believe are transformational and need to be done in the field, and I felt that I was the right person to be leading it because I was the only person who's been looking at it for 10 years, then it was not going to be a fit and things had to change. Um, Kind of like one little codicil to that, though, that I think kind of is relevant to what we talked about before in terms of some of the inconsistencies. Coming back from that, I really wanted to kind of tell this story. I wanted to
Right.
say, look, I am in a position of great responsibility in an organization that, is kind of leading the charge and kind of reducing stigma and kind of, encouraging people to take care of themselves in mental health. I think it's important for people to know what I just shared with you, kind of what led to this, why I did what I needed to do, and say, if I'm able to step away and do this, you can too. But that wasn't supported. And in some sort of way, it was, well, it could be a problem or the perception or your position. And for me, that was kind of one of the straws
Deal
that
breaker.
started breaking the camel's back. I'm like,
Mhm.
if I can't share this story and as a willing participant whose recovery journey is well established, it's in articles and all this other stuff, I'd share it. Like I'm an open book. Like there's no kind of parts of my history there that aren't well known, pretty broadly. Then how can we possibly be saying that we want to reduce the stigma and shame associated with these issues if you're special, if you're important, or if you're too
Sure.
critical to something, we can't do that. And that I think was a real shame. And so I'm glad that I'm getting an opportunity to say that with the two of you.
It's an important message, and we've talked about it a lot in different podcasts, and I'm really glad that you're sharing that because it does save lives. We talked about the rumor mill, right? The people in this field that, oh, well, they relapsed, they went to treatment, this, that, and the other. Okay, well, isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we're all about? Is we
Yeah.
want people to go get help when they need it?
Yeah. Imagine if we did that with people who had their cancer come back.
It's
It's like, oh, their
incredible.
cancer came. I mean, listen, it's insane. It's insane to me. It really
It's
is.
insane.
It really is insane to me that like the amount of judgment that we, the people who are supposed to be the most compassionate, the most understanding, and are supposed to be setting the standard, we inject into these things. Now, are we
Mhm.
doing it as overtly as we did 100 years ago? No. But in some ways, the covert nature of it, I think, is actually worse because we can operate from this navel gazing, self indulgent, patting ourselves on the back while we, grandstand and bloviate about how amazing we are and compassion and empathy. But then it means nothing if you're out in the lobby gossiping about somebody who may or may not have had an issue. Like, one, it's none of your business. Two, where's the compassion and empathy? And three, what the hell are you doing gossiping? This is not middle school. Like
Well,
that
and four, why don't
is
you ask the person how they're doing and
Exactly.
if you can
That's what
help
I was
in
gonna
some
say.
way?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
if it's a colleague, like, let's check in with our people and
And
see if everyone's okay.
to be clear, the people that do gossip in our space, we all know who you are.
yeah,
We know you from a mile away, you know? So again, I think it's really just giving us the opportunity to say the people that want to stand tall in their stories, in their strength. I mean, Brad, I'm honored for you to be able to share that on our platform because I think that too, it's everything that we're asking our families to do too that we're helping,
yeah,
right? Oh, well, we don't want to tell grandma because it's Christmas, or we don't want to tell their job because it might risk their financial trajectory for their career, right? All these reasons of why the family wants to kind of gatekeep the information. And the reality is that 1 in 4 Americans are suffering with a substance use disorder or mental health disorder.
Yeah.
1 in 4, okay? So you're not unique. Newsflash, you
Yeah.
know? Your family is not in a unique position. There are many across the board that can be a source of comfort, of help, and of strength. And so
Yeah.
thank you so much. In
Yeah.
in closing, I just wanna we do this for every interviewed guest on our podcast, which is allowing you to give a permission slip. And so just giving permission to our listeners for something that speaks to you, and we'll
Yeah, I
close
mean,
after that.
I would say it relates back to something I said before. Permission slip, urging, be curious, check your
Mm,
judgment. Look at the world is changing extremely rapidly, and the changes that are going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years, and I'm telling you from somebody who is in this space, run up against kind of the paradigm of a black swan, which is that the changes are so big, it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it. It's highly complex and highly technical, so it's hard to understand unless you have special knowledge. No one alive today has ever seen or experienced something like this. And so our tendency is going to be to favor that the status quo is what the future is going to look like. And I'm telling you, it's not. I think you're starting to feel it and see it in different areas. But the pace at which things are going to change and the way that our jobs, the way that we practice, the way that we live, the way that we socialize, it's going to look very different. What's the timeline? I like to take Bill Gates's saying with that, which is that in technology, a lot less happens in 3 years than you're told, but a lot more happens in 10 than you expected. So from
mm,
here to 2035 is going to be a significant period of transformation. And the winners and the losers, or the people who are able to succeed, or the people who are going to be emotionally more healthy, are going to be the people who really lean into their adaptability and their curiosity, that rigid
mm.
thinking, rigid behaviors, and rigid beliefs are going to reveal, people's real shortcomings as this stuff comes to fruition. So for the sake of your career, for the sake of your loved ones, and for the sake of the people that we're responsible for taking care of, it's time. I've been saying it for 10 years, but it's time. Get curious, educate yourself,
Mm.
and make no assumptions about, the future.
Thank you so much. Such a powerful episode. I'm so excited.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks so much for
Thanks,
having me.
Brad.
Thanks for tuning in to No Permission Necessary. As always, you can catch a new episode every Tuesday. Follow us at nopermissionnecessary.com. Drop us an
Yes.
email, drop us a comment, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.